Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the Committee of the Whole meeting for the District of Sechelt, April 13th, 2022. And I would like to call this meeting to order and at this time ask if there are any declarations of conflict. Seeing none, are there any additions to the agenda? May I have a motion to adopt the agenda, please? And second, all in favor? We have no appointments or delegations or new business. We're going to move straight on to business items once I declare that this work we're doing today is on the unceded territory of the Sechelt Nation. And we are grateful for that. Okay, number one, 5.1 on the agenda is Municipal Hall Needs Assessment. So at this time, can I have a motion to accept the report, please? And a second, all in favor? And I will turn the floor over to Julie, our project manager, I think.
Yes. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. I would like to welcome Quentin Talbot-Kelly and Sean Montgomery from Cornerstone Planning Group today, who will be presenting the Municipal Hall Place Space Planning Study to us. Cornerstone has been working with staff for the last several months and is joining us today on Zoom from Vancouver. At the end of their presentation, they're available for some questions if you would like that. And with that, I'll pass it on to Quentin for his presentation.
Great, thanks, Julie, and hello, Mayor and Council and members of the public. My name is Quentin Talbot-Kelly. I'm a partner at Cornerstone Planning Group and the project partner in charge for this piece of work. I will share my screen and we can go through a presentation. Julie, are you able to give me a thumbs up if you are seeing the screen properly? Perfect, great. Okay, so like Julie said, we've been working with the district over the last couple of months on a space needs assessment for the Municipal Hall. To summarize the report for the last 4+ months of work, we've identified a few different things we want to talk about. So beginning with the project context and approach that we've taken, quick review of current state of the Municipal Hall, looking at the future space needs or how we've identified or projected for the space needs, and then looking at the accommodation options that we've presented. So we've done a number of different accommodation options and sort of analyzed the pros and cons of each of them. We'll wrap up with financial implications. So projected order of magnitude costing has been done at a capital level as well as life cycle costing over a 30-year horizon. And so we'll look at that at financial implications and then finally our recommendations for a path to move forward, to move ahead. So in terms of project context and approach, the project has been initiated as a result of a few different challenges that are being experienced at the Municipal Hall. Probably you are all well aware of it, but there is some significant crowding that's taking place, which is usually as a result of just standard growth from the municipality. We've also observed that there's a significant lack of support spaces, and so that includes meeting spaces, breakout rooms, and all the types of modernized support spaces that you'd expect to see within a largely open concept or open workstation environment. And the last point that I wanted to make on current state is that the space allocations are well below modern standards. And so what I mean by that is if we just look at a high level at your current facility, we know that there are about 43 staff working from this location. And if we just look at square footage alone, we can see that about 10.2 square meters per person has been allocated, which is far below modern standards and even far below the standards that we'd expect to see with a space sharing model. And so we would expect that most offices and administrations would feel space constrained at around sort of 12 to 13 square meters per person. And we're seeing here quite a bit lower than that at 10.2. So we knew right off the bat, even with quick analysis, that overcrowding and there are some significant space constraints here. So the approach that we've taken to complete this piece of work is over 4 phases. We started our work with a preliminary analysis where we looked at high-level space assessment, so sort of the quick and dirty, which I basically just summarized for you. A gap analysis, so trying to identify how the district would change in terms of growth, looking at what they currently have and then identifying the gap. And then identifying some key future planning assumptions after we connected with all of the different department leads and teams to understand how they thought their services were going to evolve into the future. The second phase of work included the development of a functional facility program. So that's a space by space list of all of the space needs that we think are required to meet the future demand for the district. And through that process, we also had a space workshop with project team members who are on the call, as well as actually the space workshop was just with the project team. Phase 3 was the accommodation analysis, and so that's where we looked at a number of different options where we think were the most, which we think were the most suitable ways to accommodate that growth in area that's required. And then finally, we did some order of magnitude costing as well as life cycle and wrapped it up into a final report in phase 4. So you can see that the work took place from November to March, so just over 5 months. A summary of the current state. So municipal functions are taking place on the second floor of the main hall building in downtown Sechelt. We know that there are currently 43 staff as per the December 2021 estimates of staff operating from the hall. So that includes departments, administration and corporate services, engineering and operations, financial services, and the planning and development department. We also did note that there was a number of different engineering and operations folks that are operating from different locations, but that they haven't been included as part of this analysis. So with a high-level review of the current state, we were able to start identifying what's going to happen in the future. So there is a 5-year planned staff growth projection that was done internally by the district, stating that there would be plus 19 net new positions to be added over 5 years, which is significant growth. And so largely this was the largest growth factor that we considered when we were looking at future demand. And so we were planning for a 10-year future, but we knew in 5 years there would be 19 net new positions if that plan was followed. The second space driver was some shifting service functions. And so after meeting with all of the different departments, we had an overall understanding of how they expected their services to be changed over the 10-year future. So some examples of that is the development of a more robust asset management program, which will have impacts on resources. Different departments' response to climate change, stating that there are probably going to be some increasing reporting requirements, as well as some additional workload associated to responding to climate incidents. We would be remiss if we didn't consider the impacts of modernization of the workplace. We don't necessarily, from our conversations, feel that the district is necessarily ready to make the jump to a more modernized space sharing open office plan, but we did want to consider it just to show council and mayor the impacts of those potential changes. So in a world that everyone's coming out of COVID, I think this is probably at the top of everybody's mind. Working from home was considered in the modernization portion of this work, as well as a space sharing or a workspace sharing solution. It's only at a high level, but I think it is relevant to the discussion. And then lastly, and of course, the most obvious, we wanted to look at community growth to see how that was changing over into the near future to understand how that impacts the municipal functions. And so the results of the future demand analysis then translated into space needs. We are projecting that to meet the 10-year future demand for space, that you'll need about 630 component gross square meters of net new space, which is effectively double what you currently have today. And so that sounds quite shocking. And but I do want to just remind everybody that it's largely, we're not assigning too much more space per individual, but we are trying to bring it up to a modern level, which sees 13 net square meters of administration space assigned to each FTE, which from my perspective and the work that we do is on the lower end of what we'd expect most organizations to provide. It can go as high as 18, but that would be a model that includes quite a few different offices, less workstations. And so we are modernizing slightly, but really the projections that we've done for space is really just to meet the additional staff growth that's been projected. How that translates into actual spaces. So the diagram on the left-hand side shows a functional relationship diagram, which identifies the types of spaces that should be included within the future facility, assuming a single facility. And so you can see there's 3 different zones: the public zone, the support zone, and the work zone. What is lacking currently right now is a significant amount of support space for just day-to-day operations. And so that's meeting rooms of various size, as well as breakout rooms and telephone rooms to accommodate this new sort of work style that we're using, which is Zoom and telephone heavy. There was also a noted shortage of storage space. And as you're growing, more and more storage space is disappearing. So we wanted to make sure to provide an adequate amount there as well. Obviously, public zone would be publicly accessed and available to the public whenever the facility is open, and the zone where municipal functions actually happen. So for all the different departments, we'd expect that there would be some access control to these spaces. The diagram on the right-hand side is purely just to visualize how much more space we think you do require. And so you can see that the total blue area, for instance, for the support zone shows that you will require roughly double what you currently have from your current footprint. And so with this information, we were then able to identify some accommodation strategies. There's a number of different ways this space could be accommodated, but we did want to present a few different options that included a municipal hall expansion renovation. And so configuration A on the top half of the screen, you can see that we're saying that you would need to expand by the red area, roughly 580 net square meters of space, to accommodate all of the 10-year future demand over one level. Now, obviously, you're not going to build just one level of space on the second floor. And so under this configuration, the assumption would be that there would be some work, or at least a consultation with the library to understand if they have space needs that potentially aren't met, that could be accommodated as part of this expansion project. If you were to say that you wanted to increase the overall footprint of the facility on over 2 floors, you could do that within a footprint of about 300 net square meters of space, and it would look like this on the site. So that was option number 1. This option includes all of the needs going forward into the future, and so this would be a solution that meets all of the functional requirements for the 10-year future. Option number 2 is a variation of option number 1, and we wanted to present this as an option as we do know that there are some significant imminent space challenges being experienced right now that we wanted to address in one way or another. And so we do understand that the planning and design work takes quite a few years. And so we wanted to make sure that we are providing some sort of immediate relief for the challenges that you're experiencing today. And so we know that there's a shortage of workstations. And so the only solution within the current footprint without a significant renovation to increase the number of workstations is shown here on the left-hand side, where we would shift the mayor's office to a more centralized front-facing location. We would also include a couple of 3 new workstations and then 2 net new offices as a result of this plan. The biggest change here is that the business center where the mayor's office is identified in this office meeting space is now shifted to a much smaller space, which is an existing storage room. So again, this by no means addresses any of the challenges with crowding. This actually increases it. But in terms of not expanding your existing footprint and trying to make the simplest, most effective changes to provide more workstations, we saw this as a suitable solution. We would not recommend doing phase 1 of this project. And so we have included 2 additional phases, which then divert to option number 1, which is either an expansion over 2 stories over 1 floor, or you could do it over 2 stories. One floor for the 1 story, an expansion on the front of the building or expansion on the back of the building. And so again, if you did all 3 phases of this piece of work, all of the functional needs would be met, which is a benefit of this option, but in a phased approach. Option number 3 was considering a renovation and relocation of certain functions. And so we considered actually, what about if we pulled some of the existing departments out of Municipal Hall to free up space for some additional growth? And so under this configuration, we selected engineering and bylaw to potentially move to the district Seashell Operations Center, so a new facility. You would need to build about 250 net square meters of space to accommodate them, and renovate the existing space to a more modern work plan. And so this option includes a complete renovation of the existing municipal hall, but without expanding the footprint, as well as including some additional administration space at the new operations center. Should be worth noting also that this option does not meet the complete 10-year projections. It would also require additional space likely to be provided in sort of the 7 to 8 year time frame. 3 last options that were considered was a net new facility to accommodate all of the needs. So that's a facility to accommodate 1,260 net square meters of space. You would need a site of approximately 4,000 to meet all of the parking requirements. So 4,000 square meters of space per site, 1,200 square meters of a new facility. We looked at 2 different leasing configurations, 5A, which is a partial lease space, So leasing space for engineering and bylaw to alleviate some of the immediate space concerns with the municipal hall, and then renovating the existing municipal hall. And then 5B would be leasing all new space that you do require. So all 1,260 net square meters of space within the community, which, as we all know, would be an expensive option. So talking about finance, this is a summary table that shows all of the different capital costs associated with each option, as well as the 30-year life cycle cost in net present value. So the 30-year cost, but brought back to net present value dollars so that we can compare apples to apples comparison. And so what we can see here in terms of a capital cost, the most expensive option is the new build. So which makes sense because you're constructing the largest amount of space net new, and that would be around $7.7 million. And again, these are order of magnitude costing and not based off of design. So further detail will be required for budgeting. The cheapest option in this is no surprise also, which would be a partial lease and renovation of the existing municipal hall. And so again, this is the cheapest option because it largely does not meet the 10-year demand. And so when comparing the new build capital cost to the partial lease capital cost, it's quite a difference, largely because the total space needs in 5A are not met in the total space needs are not met in 5A. Obviously, the capital cost with leased fit up is quite a bit cheaper than also new build space as well. When we look at the cost over 30 years, and so any facility expansion or addition or new facility should last at least 50, but we did want to base it off of something a little bit more tangible. So we did a 30-year life cycle analysis. And so you can see that the renovation and relocation option becomes the cheapest option at about $5.5 million. Again, not meeting the total need, but a partial, and it would help alleviate some of the constraints. And the most expensive option over 30 years is a new build. One key thing to note here is that the cost of a new build over 30 years are $12.3 million, and the cost of a lease space over 30 years is just about $12 million. And so if we projected any further into the future, we would see that the leased full space option would be the most expensive option. The other thing to note is that this analysis doesn't also consider that any option where you renovate and expand the building, you are enhancing your asset. So there is a value to that could be recovered if you ever did sell it in the future, whereas the leased options, obviously you don't have any assets there. The modernization impacts, like I said, I would mention. So we did take a look at all of the different options and then estimated on a space-by-space basis how much space could be saved in those configurations if you went to a 2-day per week working from home model, as well as a space sharing model. So not assigned seating and instead shared seating. And it ranges anywhere between 10 to 15% savings. So quite significant when we factor in the cost of development. And we would say that is a fairly conservative estimate because we have worked with other groups, and Toronto being a good example, where they did the same exercise and modernized all of their spaces. They saved actually close to 33% of space. Obviously, the economies of scale for Toronto are not comparable to the District of Sechelt, but it just shows that there is a range of potential space saving opportunities if district is open to potentially a more modernized workplace arrangement. And the last slide is just some quick comparisons of our recommended options. So option number 4 from a functional standpoint actually meets all of the needs the best out of all of the different options. But we do understand that this is a cost sensitive environment, being a politically funded facility largely. And so given that constraint, we think the best and most suitable approach is to either pursue option number 1 or option number 2 under the configuration B, so the 2-story addition. So, and we think this because one, the estimates here have been estimated to meet the full 10-year needs, but either in a phased approach or throughout a construction all at once. This option has significantly good future flexibility. It does maintain use of the current facility, and then it could also provide an additional support or a process for the library procuring some additional space, which we heard through the grapevine may be a conversation. Obviously, some risks with moving ahead with option number 1 or option number 2. You definitely would want to consult the library because they will be underneath this space. Parking is already overburdened right now, and we would expect with the increase in staffing would only just increase that further. And so parking would still be a challenge in this option, and some sort of mitigation strategy would be required. And then the last significant con and risk associated with this option in comparison to a new build is that there would be significant disruption throughout the construction period. And that would be expected to take place over a long period, at least 2 years before this project could be completed. And so with our complete understanding of the district and how it functions, we would recommend option number one or option number two, which ends out in the same result, but either in a single phase approach or a multi-phase approach. And so those are all the slides that I have prepared for today's discussion and summarizing the report, and I would be happy to answer any questions that Mayor and Council has.
Thank you. Any questions from Council? Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. During the beginning part of your presentation, you talked about 19 new staff positions, and you indicated 5 years, and yet in the document, I think we're talking 10 years.
Correct.
Is that correct? So it's 10 years, okay. And then when you looked at the 10.2 square meters per person versus 12 to 13, that includes all spaces, meeting spaces, lunchroom spaces, everything. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, we're short, very short on meeting spaces.
Yes, definitely noted. And the 13 net square meters per person allocation by no means is, I'd say, fully embracing a modern solution where you'd see even more meeting spaces, but it does help address that shortfall.
Other questions, Council? Councillor Scott?
I was looking at the map of that, and I just out of the box thinking, with the parking lot that we have in behind, why couldn't we do 2 levels of parking, build out a level of office space that attaches, and then take it one step farther and do 3 layers of residential above? Do a market rental.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something that could be considered. Obviously, that's a completely different sort of model that we would have assumed throughout this process. But the one thing about the multi-level parkades, and something that we would want to avoid, is that there's significant costs with multi-level parkades, which far exceed the costs of surface parking. And so it only gets quite a bit more expensive. But if you're balancing it out with some rental marketing housing, there's potential opportunity there for sure.
It was one of the things that the chamber brought up to us was if we moved out of this space and sold the property to development. But I don't think we necessarily need to do that. But I think we could definitely utilize the space and create some rental space out of it, as well as adding to the office space that we need. Just a thought.
Thank you. Councillor Toth.
Thank you. One of the other things I identified in the report was that you're looking at a dedicated council chamber space. And, right now we share this room with the library, with community groups, things like that. I don't personally see a reason why we need to have our own dedicated space that's only going to be used a couple of times a week. That was just one observation from the report. And the other question is, I know I'd found it in the report somewhere, but when you were looking at the leasing of space, what was the rate you were using for a lease rate?
Great question. So I know the lease rate was based off of 2 examples from the community that were currently for lease. Maybe Sean, you can take a look at that value while I answer the first part of the question. So the dedicated council chambers, we do understand that is likely not to be a completely dedicated space just for council activities. We would expect that larger meetings that the district municipal staff have to find space for would be used for that function as well. And so we would say it as a shared meeting space rather than a dedicated council space. And then speaking to the lease rate, I have an information in front of me. So we looked at 2 different examples of lease rate. The base rent cost was $21 per square foot, and then the additional rent cost was $6.50. So a total rentable cost for $27.5 per square foot, and a total, and translated to square meters, it's about $300 per square meter. And we compared that against a few different standards. And so we had some data on how that compares to other municipalities in the region. And we then took the average of the existing 2 facilities that were for lease in Seashelt and then averaged them over the region's lease rate. So the average rate, after all said and done throughout this process, was $34 per square foot total rent, and or $362 per square meters.
Follow up, Councillor Todd? You look stunned. No. Any other questions from council? All right. I see that Councillor Kuster has joined us, but she doesn't have her hand up. So, seeing no further questions, thank you for the report. There's lots to think about in there. For sure, great information for us to ponder. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you for your time.
Question from Mayor Sears?
Yes, I'm wondering what staff would like us to do with this at this point. Staff has the report. Do we want to have staff move this forward, like look at the potential options and come back to us with some steps forward? Or, I like Councillor Scott's comment about the housing piece. The federal government has just come up with a whole bunch of money for housing. Maybe there's something there that could be looked at as well. I guess, what is staff looking to us to do at this point, if anything?
Through the chair, we're just looking for direction from council on where we should go from here.
Go ahead, Mayor Seegers.
I have no idea what to say here. Okay, I guess we have the report. I think we probably want staff to review the options and come back to us with steps forward, incorporating the 10-year plan for staff.
Councillor Toth.
Thank you. I think we should also consider things that weren't presented in this plan, like Councillor Scott mentioned with that back parking lot, and I'd been thinking about it too. I asked Director Allen a question relating to that when I came into the building earlier today. I don't feel like we're in a position to be like, go forth with option 2 and get those shovels in the ground. So yeah, I don't know. Like I'd like to be more involved than just seeing something move forward, but.
So would someone else like to make a recommendation? Mine wasn't seconded. Go ahead.
Okay, do we have a seconder for Mayor Seeger's recommendation? Seconded by Councillor Scott. Okay, it's on the table. Any further discussion? Okay, everyone all in favor of Mayor Seeger's resolution? Oh, listen, I'm not a good multitasker here. All right, that is passed. Okay. All right. Moving on to 5.2. Short-term rental review. I just want to say a couple things before we get started. I know it's a big agenda for a short time, a big topic, but I just want to say that I recognize that this is although I shouldn't speak on the behalf of everybody, but I know this council well, and we recognize that this is a passionate issue on both sides. We know that these are people's homes, these are people's neighborhoods, these are people who really enjoy hosting, and these are, in some cases, people's livelihoods. So this topic is something that we do not take lightly, and I would like at this point to really thank staff for all the work that they've done, but also thank the hundreds of people that have emailed us and took part in community engagement. All right, so on that note, may I have a motion to accept the reports for 5.2, and second, all in favor? And I'm going to turn it over to Director Allen.
Great, thank you, Chair Rowe, and happy to open this up and let you know what we have in mind for today in terms of presentation to you and feedback that we hope to receive. So, moving on, I think the topic of short-term rentals is complex, it's challenging. I think that's clear to everyone here at the table, that's clear to the community, that finding the right answer will certainly be difficult. There's a long history of vacation rentals in Sechelt, be it part-time owners coming up for family, be it people having B&Bs in their homes, cottages, and so forth. But however, I think what we've seen, not just in Sechelt, but everywhere really, is that online platforms have made it so much more attainable to rent out a house, or easier for people to rent out houses. Houses are now being bought for the purpose of this use for short-term rental. So it's changed things, and it's here to stay. But like any other business, there should be some regulation that speaks to the overall public interest. It's been many years, over 15 years, since previous regulations were brought in. So easy to say, harder to do. What are we going to do here? But short-term rentals touch on many topics related to adequate housing and how housing is used, and how housing is used in residential neighborhoods. Airbnb, other similar platforms have operated in ways that have taken advantage of the few regulations that we have for vacation rentals in neighborhoods. And many communities have added better ways of managing and balancing needs of the community, and Sechelt needs to follow suit in some regard, we believe. And so as part of this review, we've reviewed other communities that have done similar things, recognizing there are no identical communities to Sechelt, but we've looked at other communities as part of our public review to see what's gone on through that. So as part of our review, I'll summarize it briefly here. We've been gathering input on STRs for some time. You may recall when we did a number of surveys in late 2020 respecting the zoning bylaw update. We did one specifically on short-term rentals. We had close to 400 residents who participated in that community survey. We had several meetings with neighborhood groups, tourism associations, and so forth. We presented to Council 2 Committee of the Wholes consecutively in December to seek direction on where to go. And then in the new year, we prepped our messaging, planned meetings, so forth. And in late February and on the very first day of March, we had 4 virtual meetings hosted by Zoom. And then followed up by that, we had the survey, which was open for 2 weeks, March 1st to 14th, and we had strong response to that, over 850 responses on that survey. So we know there's interest in the community, and we know there's a lot of perspectives. And when it comes to operating short-term rentals, we know we have everything from traditional in-home bed and breakfast to a mix of bed and breakfast and cottages, to cottages and houses where the owners are not on site but are nearby, and houses where the owners are not on site, not nearby, and really don't provide any level of oversight. So we have the whole spectrum here in Sechelt, there's no question. So I think what we want to do today is to present the findings in what we call the What We Heard report. We presented this to public as well, and we'd like to follow up and present to you folks. And we'll be asking for some direction on some key topics so that we can advance preparation of bylaw amendments, amendments to our business license bylaw, to our bylaw notice enforcement system bylaw, incorporate either new policy into the proposed zoning bylaw, which you'll see in 2 weeks, or amend the existing bylaw, zoning bylaw, depending on which we all collectively agree is the best approach. So to run through today's agenda here, it's on the screen. We want to emphasize and pull out the most important questions. We want to identify that there's 9 topic areas for regulation, but really there's 3 key areas that we're seeking direction on. And those would be the categories for short-term rental within a dwelling, cottage, and then the commercial category, and the fees related to that. And just seek input, and then of course the big question, the commercial unhosted short-term rental, what to do with that. There's a range of options: allow none, put a cap on them, introduce a temporary use permit system. Each has, of course, pros and cons, and we will discuss that a little further in today's presentation. And so we have 2 folks from EcoPlan that will be joining us today. Right after this, we'll have Shanti Thurber, and Shanti will introduce a summary of the data from the surveys and what we heard from the meetings. And then followed by that, Odette Pino will run through suggested recommendations for the regulatory options and the key areas that are on the screen. And we've built in time for some questions and a longer discussion at the end. I thank you, and I will pass over to Shanti.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Shanti, and I'll be providing a summary on what we heard during the public consultation on these draft short-term rental regulations. So over the past couple of months, through the survey and public consultation meetings, we have heard from many community members. 857 people took the time to complete the survey, and 146 attended public consultation meetings. This is very clearly, from the amount and quality of responses we received, a topic that residents really care about. Approximately 7% of the community participated in the survey. So public consultation meetings were designed for us to present draft regulations. And at the meetings hosted on Zoom, we used Mentimeter to poll for general sentiment and check-in, and to make it more engaging. And in these meetings, the surveys were clearly stated to be the desired way for us to gather input for commenting on draft regulations. The survey opened on March 1st, intentionally after the 4th meeting was delivered, because we wanted input on specifics of the regulations, the draft regulations. The survey walked through step-by-step questions specific to the draft regulations, and that is what we are presenting on today. In terms of who participated, we asked a few questions to gauge the balance of operators and non-operators, as well as residents and non-residents. We saw notable differences between the meetings and the survey. Namely, meeting attendees were far more likely to have operated a short-term rental in the past 12 months, with 45% of those attending meetings being short-term rental operators, whereas only 18% of those who responded to the survey were short-term rental operators. Meeting attendees were also less likely to be residents of Seashelt than survey respondents, with 71% of those in the meetings being residents of Seashelt and 82% of survey respondents being residents. There are 2 definitions that were and are an important basis for the proposed regulations. Principal residency, where the homeowner lives full-time, this includes your house and your property, on site, or an authorized full-time resident lives. Secondary residency is where the owner does not live in the house or on the property full-time. It is not occupied by a full-time resident. And to explain these, we used the term accessory, which is a room in a home like a B&B, and suite, which is a self-contained unit on a property. And those fall under the principal residency category. And the secondary residence category contained the short-term rental commercial. We heard that community members are supportive of short-term rentals where there is an owner or operator or on-site manager living on the short-term rental property. An accessory, which is a room in a home, suite, self-contained units on a property, and accessory and suites, which was a category that we inserted in the survey based on feedback in the public consultation meetings. We're all well supported with a 63+% support in each of these categories. However, where there is not an owner on site or operator, there was a 64% objection rate. What this tells us is that community members in general are supportive of short-term rental categories in principal dwellings and not supportive of those in secondary dwellings. One key finding was a tension point around the proposed short-term rental commercial category. In general, residents are not supportive of short-term rental licenses for secondary homes that don't have an owner or resident on site. This, along with many written comments provided by community members, expressed concerns about the use of residential neighborhoods for unhosted accommodations. When survey participants were asked their opinions on a cap of 30 commercial short-term rental licenses, 62% objected to this proposition. And of those who objected, 88% wanted to see less than 30 licenses. Half of those who objected wanted to see none. Coupled with written feedback, we heard an overall lack of support for the short-term rental commercial license category. In December of 2021, Council was asked to rank overall priority objectives for short-term rental, residential rental regulations and management. And we found that overall there was a strong alignment with Council priorities in the community. 65% of survey respondents agreed or strongly agreed with this order. And when those who did not agree were asked what their preferred reorder would be, you can see what happened. Just so the top right is Council priorities and the bottom right is those who did not agree. And they are exactly the same order. It's just a slightly different distribution with more of a lead for encouraging neighborhood fit, and enabling supplemental income is slightly behind. And then protection of long-term rental supply, promoting business and regulatory equity, and supporting the tourism industry are kind of more similar. For those who attended public meetings, they were more likely to rank supporting the tourism industry and enabling supplemental income as their priorities. There was a strong support for rooms in houses, secondary suites, and accessory buildings operating as short-term rentals. This said, there were controversial opinions over short-term rentals of entire homes. There was also an other category in which residents could list other types of accommodations that could be regulated, and community members included accommodation types such as travel trailers, campers, RVs, boats, tiny homes, tents and yurts, and some others as well. When community members were asked their support for a cap of 3 bedrooms per short-term rental, survey respondents agreed with up to 3 bedrooms in the owner's principal residence. And along with this, when asked if they supported 1 parking stall on site, most did. And for those who didn't, they mainly wanted to see less than 1 stall. We also heard in the written feedback that some properties cannot accommodate many parking stalls on property and rely on street parking. Overall, there was a strong support for no limit on the number of rental days in the calendar year for all categories. And for those who objected, most wanted to see 0. Community members are concerned with compliance and enforcement of existing short-term rental business licenses and wanted to know how proposed regulations could be managed and enforced to ensure compliance. Survey respondents expressed concern with limited enforcement staff and frustrations with lack of response when complaints were made. People expressed that they stopped complaining as there was not much the district of Sechelt could do under the existing regulatory framework. The survey asked people about their views on fees based on business type, and the proposed fees were $250 per year for the accessory category, $700 per year for the suite category, and $3,000 per year for the commercial category. The proposed fees are in line with similarly sized communities who are also paying for third-party monitoring services like the District of Squamish. We heard there may be interest for simplifying the fee structure and also strong support for full cost recovery, where business license fees entirely pay for the short-term rental regulatory program and not taxes. There was an overall lack of support for the proposed fees. 46% of participants objected to the fees, and of those who did not support, they either wanted to see much higher fees or something else. The most frequently mentioned wants in the something else category were full cost recovery to pay for enforcement and also support for higher fees for short-term rentals of secondary residences. In a few sentences, here is what we heard. There is general community alignment with the order of council priorities, directing regulations for neighborhood fit first and protection of long-term rental supply second. There is support for short-term rentals that have principal residency requirement that occur with the owner or a full-time resident manager on site. And there's objection to short-term rental commercial category for short-term rentals that occur in secondary residences that are unhosted. Thank you. I will turn it back to Andrew.
Great, thank you, Shanti. So Shanti has presented the data, some information. We'll have, again, moving forward into regulatory options, but I'll just pause here for a moment if you have any questions about what you just heard that you would like to ask.
Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. Are you just asking us to see if we have any questions on the data?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, no, data's clear. Thank you.
Anybody else? Councillor Scott?
I think it might be good to clarify the difference between the accessory versus the commercial. So if I have a house and I have a studio in the back, is that classed as an accessory? What if I have 3? Is it still accessory, or are we moving into commercial now?
If I may, through the chair, and respond to that question. Thank you. So it's based on principal residency. So the accessory category was if there is a resident on site, it could be the owner, it could be a full-time resident, it could be any number, it could be any unit type. That, if it has a principal resident, we gave them the names of STR accessory when it is XTR accessory was the name that was given for B&B, like a room in a home. STR suite was also principal residency, and then STR commercial was exclusively for when it's a secondary resident and there is no full-time resident on site, they are unhosted. So the example that you gave, Councillor Scott, and you are the owner, and there were multiple self-contained accommodations on the property, that is in the principal residency category.
Okay, I wouldn't necessarily agree that we should class it that way. I think, you know, for properties that are that have 3 and 4 and 5 different cabins on their property, I think it definitely slides it into the commercial category. I'm not saying I want them to go away by any means, but I think I would view that as a commercial operation.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Scott. To clarify, we're just asking questions about the data, and then we're going to get into the discussion further down. So hold that thought. Councillor Toth.
Thank you. Just a quick one, because I know that we've received email feedback from Sunshine Coast Tourism and the Seashell Chamber. Has that feedback that may not have been collected through the conventional survey process, has that been collated into your data in any way?
If I may, through the chair. Yeah. This one. Thank you. Our collection of data was strictly in the public realm, so it was through the survey and also through the consultation sessions.
Any other questions from council about the data? No. Hold your tongue, Councillor Scott. All right, over back to you, Director Allen.
Great. So we'll take the next step in the presentation and get into the more details of regulatory options, and be pleased to pass that over to Odette to walk us through that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Chair Rowe and committee members. During the consultation, we heard that there is a long history of good vacation rental operators and also an appreciation for them providing important tourism accommodations in Seashelt. So there was a good acknowledgement that the range of opportunities has benefited from having STRs. And there is strong support for STRs that operate in an owner or authorized full-time residence home. So it could be either rooms in a main home or on their property in a suite, a cottage, a cabin. And so that's STR accessory and STR suites is the categories that were consulted on in this with the draft regulations. And STR commercial, where it's a secondary residence, was not as supported. So we've heard that through the What We Heard report. And the STRs with residents who live on site are seen to have a greater degree of accountability and responsibility that's consistent with council's priority objective of ensuring good neighborhood fit. We also heard that there's a desire to simplify the category to allow both suite, STR suite, so in the home, and STR that's a self-contained accommodation on the principal residence property to operate both. And we heard that there was some concerns about excluding having a limit of only one business type per property. So this is our recommendation. And we would like council direction on this. We're recommending that there be two business categories, license categories that are based on meeting the principal residency requirement, where there is an owner or authorized full-time resident on site, that it can be in the room of the principal home or the self-contained dwelling unit on the property. And we recommend that there be no caps or limits on those STRs. So there can be an unlimited number of those in the community, in the neighborhood, on the property. You can have both. Council may wish to choose to have a limit, as we heard, per property, but this is what we're recommending at this time. And I wanted to pause to point out that we're seeking direction of a decision on this one. This one had a good alignment, and that I wanted just to pause, maybe stop share screen, and just check in with Chair Rowe and council members to request direction. It would be our request to kind of take this in chunks that are bite-sized pieces to walk through the logic, or you can just ask me to continue presenting all options, all categories. But if there is some logic in stopping and saying you'd like to consider this one piece, and then we can move on to the next two priorities, which are what to do with STRs when they're in commercial, like the secondary residences, and then also business license fees, and then carry the presentation on to some other broader topics. So I want to be mindful of time, but I wanted to ask what you would like. So this is one topic which we would like your direction on.
I would prefer to do one topic at a time. What's council's wish? Does that sound good? All right. So can we put the slide back up with the recommendation from Odette? All right, so recommendation 1, principal residency. Comments from council. Councillor Toth.
Just a clarification. So looking at the first one, room, principal home, that would be a home share type situation versus the second one, which would be either a secondary suite, cabin, a suite over the garage, things like that. I just wanted to clarify the room, principal home.
The room in principal home is like B&B. So currently you have that as a home occupation. And the self-contained unit on a property is, as you said, a self-contained unit, any kind. That is a habitable unit, licensed and legal.
Any follow-up? No? Any other questions? Mayor Seegers?
This would be a question for staff. So currently we'd be looking at somebody who could potentially have an accessory and a suite on a property. We would categorize them currently as a suite. What kind of workload would that be for staff to be able to distinguish between those? Is it, I mean, I'm looking, do we need two? Do we just only have one?
Director Allen.
Sure, thank you, Chair Rowe. Great question. In terms of workload, I think it's not significantly more. We'd have to look at the zoning to confirm that the zoning does in fact allow a secondary suite on the property. Some properties do, some properties do not. If it's a dwelling, is it safe? Was it constructed recently and meet the BC building code? Is it an older dwelling? And perhaps we would put in inspection to ensure safety and fire plans and hydrants and so forth, right? But yeah, it provides some work, but it's not excessive in that amount.
Follow up? Any, Councillor Scott?
So this would be where I made my comment before, where I think in a property where there's a resident on board that on site that has multiple units on the site, there has to be a point where they move into a commercial. I don't view it as, like, I agree with what we have up there where we don't necessarily need caps or limits placed, but I think even at that stage, I would like to see them move into a commercial status with the commercial fee, not necessarily detracting from the number, because I'm thinking of the businesses that we have in town that are like that, and I really respect what they do, and they're great people. But we have to realize that it is a commercial operation and should be treated as such. So I don't know if there's a way that we can push that into a commercial that doesn't have a cap or limit, but does recognize that those are actual commercial operations. And what in my personal opinion, I would say more than two. Maybe it's more than one, but I think by the time you have three or more on there, you're a commercial operation.
Councillor Kuster, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Leading off of what Councillor Scott just said, so in this category right now, currently as it's proposed, the person that has 3-4 cabins on their property, they would only pay the $250.
We're not that far yet, Jen.
Well, that's what I'm trying to understand. So, like, based on what Councillor Scott said versus this category, are we looking at, is it 250 for the whole property, or is it 250 per unit? I'm just looking for clarification on that.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here for a second. I think what they're talking about is if it's a room in a house, that's an accessory. Anything else would be the suite category. So they would have, if they have currently, the way it's being proposed, if they have two different buildings on there, but they live there, it would be the suite, which would be the higher rate.
Follow up, Councillor Kuster.
So it would be $750 for someone who had, say, 2 cabins.
If I may, through the chair, if I may answer through the chair, we have not started to talk about the business license categories and the fees and what those fees are, which is my third recommendation. And so the numbers, I would prefer not to speak about that because I'm recommending something different than what Councillor Kuster is citing from the consultation. But there could be a limit on the number of business license, the number of business license types, and that each would be charged at its rate. And that there could be a cap on that, but it's really a council decision, and all of these things are a council decision. So the sequencing is of presentation. I haven't talked about the fees yet. That's the third topic. Okay, so to review, what you're looking at us for is, do we support recommendation 1, which is principal residency, recommending 2 business categories based on meeting principal residency requirements, owner or authorized full-time resident on site. And as part of that, then the no caps or limits placed on the number of allowable STRs when principal residency is met. Councillor Scott.
So I'd like to move that we amend this recommendation to limit the self-contained suites to 2. And if it's a principal residence with more than 2 suites on the property, that they move into the commercial category.
Is there a seconder for that recommendation? Councillor Toth has seconded. The recommendation is on the floor for further discussion. Mayor Segers?
So what the recommendation is that we would have two business categories. One would be accessory, one would be suite, but that the suite would be limited to two separate suites from the primary. And if it's more than that, they move into commercial. Perfect, thank you.
Yes.
So just to further clarify, Councillor Scott, they could have a room in their house and two cabins before they move to commercial. Okay. Director Allen, did you have something to say?
Just would like to, thank you, Chair, back that up and suggest that that does make sense because the R1, the R2 zone wouldn't be allowed to have multiple dwellings beyond the house and the cottage anyways, in which case, if it ever were to happen, it would be a rezoning application. So it does make sense, right? The R1 zone is not zoned for a dwelling and a bunch of cabins everywhere. That's commercial.
Correct.
Or a travel trailer.
Mm-hmm.
Mayor Segers.
So clarification on the zoning then. So if, to follow up what Councillor Scott says, if they have a suite in their house and then they have one cabin, that's legal on an R1. If they have two cabins, it's not?
Correct, and the one cabin would require a certain property size threshold to achieve it as well, right?
Okay.
So, but we're assuming we're talking about these low density residential zones where most of our short-term rentals are located. Any dwelling can have a suite inside of it. Some properties can have a secondary cottage, but not all properties. And that's basically it for the zoning, right? So if one did want to have 3 and 4, they would have to apply for rezoning out of the R1 zone, and that would match with the commercial category. So it does make sense.
So essentially, does zoning then take care of Councillor Scott's concern on its own without us addressing it in this recommendation?
Likely, but the recommendation is helpful.
Okay. Councillor Toth.
Thank you. I personally, just in hearing the comments being made, I don't think that zoning would take care of it because we're talking about self-contained units. It doesn't address the RVs or the yurts or the motor home that's being used as a Airbnb type space because it's not a dwelling unit on a foundation as the zoning bylaw would consider it. So I think this sort of goes a little bit further than the zoning bylaw alone.
Okay, any further comment, Director? Okay. Oh, Councillor Lamb.
Oh, this is such an interesting discussion because it is. I know people that are renting out their motor homes or tent trailers or whatever they have, whatever anybody will rent. They're doing that, so they have 2 units and then they rent out whatever they've got. So that becomes 3. And then, I remember years ago that, people built their houses specifically to have 3 or 4 units, 3 or 4 rentals in the unit. And this would have been, 25 years ago, probably. So it's just quite an interesting discussion anyways, and on top of it all, you end up with 3, if you end up with 3 units, you end up with the extra usage of the infrastructure of the community. So it's, it's a big discussion. That's all I can say.
Okay, so the recommendation on the table reads as recommendation 1 does with a limit of 2 self-contained units. And all in favor? Opposed? Anybody? Janice, are you still with us? Oh, there she is. I think I'll do it again because I didn't see Janice. Janice, can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I'm going to read the recommendation again. Recommendation 1 for principal residency, recommending 2 business categories based on meeting principal residency requirement, owner or authorized full-time residents on site with a limit of 2 self-contained units on the principal property. All in favor? So moved.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Rowe. And I will continue with the next slide then. And so the next category is topic of discussion is where STRs are taking place in secondary homes. And this is not the owner's principal residence or dwelling on a property. And in the consultation, 30 commercial STRs was what was being asked and gauged for would there be support for that. And so this was the highest tension and opposition around permitting of this category. And the draft regulations brought up many implementation questions. So questions were raised around what's the appropriate number? What should be that cap or limit? What are some practical conditions around how to allocate these? Should they be first come, first serve? Should it be a lottery? Issues of fairness were raised, rewarding good operators, removing licenses from poor operators. Concerns were also raised about STRs and secondary residents and the impact on residential neighborhoods and having larger housing availability concerns in the District of Sechelt. So this was truly the most controversial aspect of the draft regulations. And this is the one that we're really asking for council direction. Next slide, please. And so we're going to be asking for council direction on the commercial secondary residence category. There are a few options. We are going to present 2 options, but maybe there's others that council members would like to bring forth. The draft bylaws, they recommended we're testing for 30 licenses, but maybe it's a fewer or more licenses, the number, what is that number? Option A is to have a certain number of those and what that cap would be. Option B is to say no commercial secondary residence licenses. And the best practice in British Columbia is to not permit any to be secondary residences. So I want to explain both of those options. Perhaps after I explain these, there might be another option that is brought forth, but I'll just take a moment to really explain each of those. So while we recognize that there is no match for Sechelt and that every community is different and that every regulatory environment needs to be unique to match its community, we have looked at 2 coastal communities that have a similar size and context to Sechelt, and it's valuable to explain how do they manage STRs in secondary homes and residences. So both Tofino and Squamish are good communities that have regulations that are known to support an excellent experience for both tourism visitors and that work for residents. So in the case of Tofino, their regulations established in 2017, they have about 300 STRs operating today, and they have there is no STRs for secondary residences, so none are permitted to be unhosted. There's 2 categories. One is a category where it's a B&B, it's a home occupation, so there can be rooms within a home, a principal residence. And then there's another category of STR where it has the principal residency requirement. So it can be an owner or a full-time resident is on site. It can be a suite in a home. It can be attached, detached, self-contained. That's really the only criteria that it meets the principal residency requirement. And also there's 3 strata buildings in Tofino that are zoned tourist commercial that allow for the individual owners, if they have strata bylaw approval and council approval, that they can rent them as well. So, but that's limited to 3 buildings. So the reality is 0 commercial of secondary residences, and then the B&B within the home and the principal residency requirement for anything that's an accessory building. For Squamish, their regulations are 1 year old, so just slightly more than a year. And there are today about 140 STRs operating. There is no allowable STRs in secondary residences. There is a principal residency requirement. And that is the principal residences, a room in a home or the entire home can be rented. And then if there is STRs with principal residency, STRs of secondary suites or an accessory unit on that property, it requires a temporary use permit. So it's even more rigorous. It requires, they've set a cap of 30 temporary use permits, which currently 18 are delegated, and that allows for the accessory units to be with a cap of up to 30 to be STRs in their community. So just to give a bit of context. So it's worth explaining what is a temporary use permit, and I'll explain this is a possible option, and it would allow for a limited number of STRs in secondary homes. And that exists, I'll call it TUPs for short, otherwise I'll be tripping on this word. And the thought behind them is that it will allow for more robust selection process. It can allow for the neighborhood fit, which is council's #1 priority. And STRs of the non-principal residences, they're really a commercial use, and they have more impacts in residential neighborhoods. So these logically should be regulated to a higher standard than STRs in an operator's principal dwelling or their property with an on-site resident. The TUPs are applied in the District of Sechelt to temporary commercial uses. They exist today. They can be issued for up to 3 years and renewed once for an additional 3 years, so a total of 6 years. And TUPs allow for more consideration with conditions that are specific to a property. They require that the neighbors be notified. There's an opportunity for public input, and it requires council approval, each one. The TUPs have more robust requirements and process that can be better tailored to a property, and that can support a better experience for both the visitors and the neighboring residents. Once a TUP is issued, the STR operator is very motivated to comply with the management conditions to keep that permit in good standing. They certainly wouldn't want to lose it. It takes more effort. And should council prefer this direction, the added time and the costs of processing TUPs, it'll have more staff demands and budget implications. This also needs to be considered. So it's not without some costs. So I'd like to just go through the 2 options and what are the pros and cons of each of these. The pros and cons of having a limited number of secondary residences that are licensed, the number to be determined by council using a TUP. So the pros are that temporary use permits, they allow for a limited number of these residences to continue. It recognizes that some exist today and it allows a transition time. And it also gives clear messaging to prospective home buyers that have been calling the district and asking staff, I want to buy a home with this intent to STR. It's a very clear response. The staff can say, well, there's no guarantee that you will get this permit. And here's the system that exists, but there's no guarantee. So there's also the cons are that how do you set a cap or limit the number? We don't really know. It is a more labor intensive process with staff and department review and has budget implications of taking up more time. It requires council approval for each application. There's public notice and information meetings for each application. There's a potential fatigue with that, also for neighbors and residents as well. And it adds compliance and monitoring enforcement demands to have this category. So that's the pros and cons of having a limited number of commercial licenses that it's recommended to consider using temporary use permits. So what about option B, 0 STRs of secondary residences, not allowing any? So the pros are that the principal residency requirement, it's a best practice standard in BC communities. And there is clarity for residential neighbors and neighborhoods that it aligns also with what we heard in the consultation feedback, that these were the most concerning. It is less complex to set up the business licensing system and to do the compliance monitoring and enforcement. The cons are that this will impact existing secondary residences and operators. It's not clear how many will be impacted, and the market and STR operators will find a way to adjust to the new regulatory conditions. Some owners might be able to add a long-term resident to the home or to the property. Some might allow for that, and maybe there's other means. It would be pretty case specific. And certainly the Landlord Tenancy Act permits for fixed term rentals where both parties agree to an end date for seasonal residents. So it'll vary. Each case will be unique, and it may impact the availability of some STR accommodations. It's not clear how many would be affected. So recommendation number 2 is that the consultant team recommends not allowing any secondary residences to be STRs, and that limiting it just to principal residency requirement. But ultimately, this is a council decision, and we're seeking direction before drafting proposed STR regulations. So I want to once again pause, check in with Chair Rowe and committee members. This is a topic that requires council direction. I do have 3 additional slides, and I'd also like to ask you for your direction on setting business licenses. However, this was the most controversial, challenging topic, and there is a desire to really get council direction on this topic in particular. So I'll just ask to stop screen share and check in with Chair Rowe. And how would you like to proceed?
I think we should discuss this at this time. I'll just ask a couple questions before I turn it over to council. And maybe this is for Director Allen. Are temporary use permits, if it's granted and someone sells, is it transferred to the new owner, or would they have to reapply?
Great question. I looked it up today in the Local Government Act, the legislation that outlines various developments and permits and so forth. And the specific wording says that temporary use permit is issued to an owner for the land. So that I interpret that as it belongs to the property, because fundamentally we're regulating use and not user. That said, the seller would have to disclose to the buyer, I've got this temporary use permit and I'm 18 months into it, because the clock wouldn't start back at day 1 again just because the property transferred.
Right.
Yeah.
So they'd have to say, I only have a year left, or.
That's right. That would be by interpretation, that they do appear to be transferable.
Okay. And in a perfect world, would we be looking at January 2023, January 2024? For what are your thoughts?
It is a complicated one. If we look at temporary use permit, first of all, we'd have to develop a program. We'd have to find out today how many we're looking at, for example, the criteria for selection, how we present them. If we present them in a batch all at once, in all likelihood, it would be possible to do by January 2023, but it would be a challenge, no question. But it's possible. It would be an impact. It doesn't come without a cost, and I noted that in the staff report, just touched on it. The cost of, if it's existing staff level, who's now doing it and what was going to be happening during those weeks is now being done, is in addition to the HR complement and so forth, and we just have to figure that part of it out.
Okay, thank you. And I see Odette had her hand up. Did you? Or was I seeing things?
Thank you,
Go
Chair
ahead.
Rowe. Consistent with Director Allen's comments, the temporary use permit is also registered on title. And so it does have a date, and it has an expiry too. So it is transfers with the land. That is correct.
Okay, thank you. All right, questions from council. Mayor Seegers.
Sorry, just to follow up on the temporary use permit. So if somebody is given a temporary use permit, potentially 3 years, they could apply or request an extension for another 3 years. What happens at the end of 6 years?
Great question. We're venturing into the unknown a little bit. By logic, it's temporary, so that means that it does come to an end at some point. So I would suggest most logical approach would be After year 5, if all's going well, gear up and make a rezoning application to formalize it. After year 5, if it's not going so well, then you know it's coming to an end. And so we would, if we're going to report back on this topic, we'll do some deeper research with success and challenges that other municipalities have had.
Other, Councillor Scott.
So after 6 years, that property is essentially dead for eternity, unless they rezone it. And somewhere we keep a record of that?
Well, ultimately, I think we would seek a legal opinion on that. The legislation in the Local Government Act does not precisely stipulate that, but going on the intent, and it's not permanent, but it's a little less than 100% crystal clear.
Follow up? No? Okay, you, Stu. Any other questions from Council? Mayor Seegers?
Thank you. To the consultant, you've got the 2 recommendations and you're looking to us for a recommendation. I looked up the hotels that actually Tofino and Squamish have, and we don't compare there, right? Hotels in Tofino, I pulled up 7, and Squamish 10. So we have 2, and admittedly they're on the fairly small side. So I'm not in favor of no commercial STRs at this point. I would like to see a process put in place where this bylaw gets revisited so that if things change in Sechelt and we get additional hotels, that we revisit the commercial STR piece. So at this point, I'm not in favor of 0.
Any other comments from Council? Councillor Toth?
Thank you, Chair. This is the section that I'm sort of struggling with, I think, the most out of all of it, and I am leaning towards 0. 0 would definitely inspire some hotels to move to Sechelt or to consider building in Sechelt. And just because you can't have a commercial STR in Sechelt doesn't mean you couldn't have a commercial STR in this end of Red Roofs Road in Half Moon Bay. Technically speaking, well, were you flying under the radar? You sure? Yeah, it's illegal in those areas for sure to not have owner occupied, but we know it's happening, just like we know it's happening here, regardless of what the rules currently in place are. The fact is, you know, we've heard pretty loudly from the community where the problems are, and the problems that we are getting from the community are with the commercial operators. I know we've heard back from a lot of people that have bought homes to be secondary residences, to be turned into short-term rentals, and, oh, what about my investment? And that property is still worth a lot of money as a house to somebody. And ultimately, we try not to have businesses in our residential neighborhoods. And if they want to run it as a hotel, then they should come forward for a rezoning.
Councillor Scott.
I think the one thing that we need to create in the other is where we do have those properties that have more than 2 suites and residency on site. We need to create something for them so that they're covered and not lost. Because I don't want to lose them, but right now they're not falling into this. Like I don't want them panicking right now, saying, "Well, we're capped at 2," and no, that's not. So we need to create something for that. I'm with Mayor Seegers on this. I don't think 0 is the right number at this time, and it could be revisited down the road. You know, the business owners that have reached out in concern, and rightly so, that a lot of their tourism business relies on the short-term rentals right now, and would be greatly affected if they went away. So I'm not interested in 0 being a number. And I'm still trying to wrap my head around this temporary use permit. I don't necessarily think it's the answer either.
Councillor Toth.
Yeah, I suppose it's a question for Director Allen, actually. If somebody has a short-term rental operation that is not owner-occupied, is there anything preventing them today from coming forward to look at a rezoning application into the commercial zoning?
Great question, of course. No, there wouldn't be. I think in all likelihood, again, assuming we're in the low density residential OCP designation in an R1 or R2 zone, it would be an amendment to the official community plan, which sometimes can be a barrier in terms of support from staff or the community council, but one does have the ability to make a rezoning application. Yes.
I think I'll just make a comment before you, Madam Mayor, get going. I mean, ultimately, I think I'd like to see us in a place where there was zero in residential areas. So just a couple comments though, and I think I've read in a couple hundred emails around why are we doing all this work when there's only been X number of bylaw complaints? And I just want to put it out there that this is pretty much the number one topic that we all heard about when we were running for election in 2018. It's the number one topic I hear about in the grocery store, in private messages on Facebook, at the hospital. Like, this is a topic that is important to everybody, and we're not doing this based on, it's not as simple as saying, why are you even looking at commercial when there's only been X number of complaints to bylaw. So that's number one. Number two, one of my concerns is I know full-heartedly how many are being used to house nurses. And that's a big selfish concern to me. I'm not saying it's our responsibility to house, staff like VCH, school districts, all that sort of thing, as things move on, are starting to look at housing themselves, but that's not where we're at right now. So that is a concern for me. I think we need a time of transition. So I will not be supporting zero at this time. What that looks like as a plan, I'm not sure at this point, but those are my thoughts and comments right now. Go ahead, Mayor Seegers.
Thank you. I do like the temporary use permit. I mean, we are hearing from the commercial class of short-term rentals where they say our neighbors are really okay with what we're doing. Well, the temporary use permit would check that out. It would require consultation with the neighbors in the area to find out, are they in favor of this? I mean, I know of one block in community where there are 3. And when I asked the residents in the area what they could do, like, what could we put in place that would allow the 2 that you like to continue to operate, but the 1 that you don't to not, this actually would take care of that. Because if we had to ask the residents and the residents said, no, we're not in support of this, then they would not get their temporary use permit. They would not be licensed.
I too like the thought of what the temporary use permit can bring insofar as neighborhood fit and consultation. I do worry a little bit about pitting neighbors against each other, but I think, to some extent, our life in the last 2 years has already done that. I think what people need to what the neighbors need to remember, though, and what we need to consider, because as Odette said, this is considered public consultation, which is what we asked, but we do need to consider what tourism has said to us and what the chamber has said to us, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the neighbors need to remember that as well, that this, perhaps there is actually people working in the community that are staying in that house for a couple of weeks. So it's not just as, I don't want people to make it as cut and dry as it might be, because I don't think it is. It's a part of our community. Go ahead, Councillor Toth.
Thank you. My concerns with the temporary use permit is it's a political decision. You know, we might go through the process and the neighbors might all come out up in arms about it, but whoever is sitting at this table might approve it anyways. There's no, you know, legislative requirement to deny it if X percentage of the neighbors disagree with it. So that's sort of my concern with the temporary use permit process. Yes, it has worked well in the district of Sechelt in the past for what it's been used for. But with the renting to agencies, whether it's school board, Vancouver Coastal Health, things like that, Councillor Rowe, drawing on your expertise, when you mentioned, you know, nursing staff coming up for a couple of weeks and then leaving, does VCH then turn over the house, or do they just have different staff coming in and staying? My question basically comes to, is there any reason why VCH, in this example, couldn't lease the house on a long-term basis?
Oh, I can't speak on behalf of VCH. You're going to get me fired, Alton. Oh my goodness.
What about the school board?
So the solution, right now, agency nurses, housing is arranged by their agency. So Solution Staffing, for instance. And I have no idea how that works. I do know that nurses definitely have stayed in the same place. So whether they have a lease with that place, I'm not sure. So quite likely, it would be my guess that short-term rentals are definitely, they'd be smart to take advantage of that, and they possibly could be. I don't know how you would differentiate that from anything else, though. Mayor Seegers?
I believe that the company that hires the agent or the agency nurses actually has a long-term lease on the property, and then they rent it out. So it wouldn't necessarily be considered even a short-term rental because they have the long-term lease.
True, but there's like 4 agencies now, and we're just talking VCH. So I'm not sure where it sits, but it definitely is. And I have an Airbnb on my corner, and I know, you know, there's been like trades workers living there for a week or 2 at a time. So it's not just healthcare. Yep. Go ahead, Councillor Scott.
The problem I have with the temporary use permit is that if it goes to notice on title, it effectively adds value to the property. And there's no reason why we can't create the same process as you would go through for a temporary use permit that is tied to the individual. And when they sell the house, that business license goes. It disappears. The new owners, who are a different personality, different views on life, they're not just automatically being given a temporary use permit when we may not necessarily agree with their values. So I really struggle with a temporary use permit. I would happily take the process, but tie it to the business license. If the property's sold, that license is gone. And then the new owners, if they choose to go down that road, if there's still room available to apply, it's a brand new process, a brand new interview, understand their personality and their values.
Mayor Seegers?
Okay, so that's a question for staff. Can we make conditions on the temporary use permit that would allow us to pull it if the conditions aren't fulfilled? So we get complaints potentially, it gets sold, somebody complains about the new owner, we put in a process where we pull it back. They can no longer have that. Is that possible?
Director Allen?
Thank you. I would suggest that you put in conditions into a temporary use permit that are required regardless of who owns it, right? So that they would be matching the proposal. So if somebody else comes in and runs it a different way that doesn't match it, then the TUP could be considered null. Business licenses do need to be updated when there's a new owner. And that would certainly happen on a commercial property in the downtown core. So it's the same thing. Somebody changes, they have to update their business license. So I think both of those cases, there is this. But we need to enhance and increase our oversight of operations. to where we are at right now, which is pretty rudimentary, really, an issuance of a permit. We haven't really even conducted regular and dependable inspections on short-term rentals, for safety and so forth, right? So those are some of the 9 categories, less so needing direction today because they seem like they're more technical in nature, but there are things that we can do to enhance our ability to know what's going on certain properties.
Councillor Kuster, oh yeah, there you are. Do you have any comments?
Sure. Yeah, I do. I agree with Councillor Scott. I don't think we can go to 0 STRs in our community at this time. We're just not equipped right now to accommodate the number of people that require accommodation when they come here to support our tourism, to support our local economy. So at this time, I do not support no commercial STRs. Where I think we do need to differentiate STRs somewhat commercial because there's people who operate commercial STRs that don't live on the coast at all, but there's people that operate commercial STRs that they live right next door. How do we differentiate that is kind of my concern. And yeah, that's all I have to say right now.
Thank you. Other comments? He's good? All right, Councillor Scott.
I guess the other question, like, how many are we talking here? Have we actually got a number? Through the Echo Plan, did anybody tally it up? How many? 100?
Of commercial?
Yeah, that would be standalone units. Do we know?
So thank you. We, through the chair, we don't know how many are existing right now. The third-party compliance monitoring program that we have data from uses the term entire home as a definition, which only means that it's self-contained. We don't have further data. Once a municipality engages and retains the services of the third-party compliance monitoring company. So in the case of Seashell, I'm ballparking that it's about $16,000 a year. Then you get much more detailed data, and there's a lot more data that's fed into the system through also enhancing your business licensing requirements. And that's also explained in the memo. There is limited data right now. We don't know the scale of how many. I don't know if I'm answering your question, or if your question is how many did the What We Heard report say would be a palatable number. I can also speak to that, but I don't know if that's your question or if I answered your question. Go ahead.
I think really what it comes down to is this data that we need. I think that we need solid data that we can have an understanding of what the ramifications are of the decision, and without that data, we can't. So anybody who responded to the survey for whatever side of the fence they were on, obviously is making that recommendation based on no data. So I just really wonder how we can even make a decision on this without it.
Any other comments? Go ahead, Mayor Seegers.
I agree. We don't have that information. I mean, what we do have, I think, is how many houses are secondary dwellings in Seashell. And we don't know. I mean, do we pick a number? I don't know. Maybe the first year we say, well, but then we can't do temporary use permits. I don't know if there's a way to actually get that information.
Well, I mean, sounds like with a $16,000 investment, we can get closer. But I really struggle with us making any sort of decision here without understanding what the ramifications are. And so.
Mayor Seegers.
I wonder if we reach out to somebody like Sunshine Coast Tourism, because they actually have the software, could potentially, but again, that doesn't break it down. Like Odette is saying, it says separate unit. So that could be a suite or a separate cottage on a primary residence. We don't know.
It made it even a struggle with the emails that we got. And we had, of course, we got lots of emails from both sides, but the hundreds of emails that we got from operators, all they said is that they were operators within the district of Sechelt. There was no address attached to it. I mean, we can't, quite a number of them didn't really differentiate whether they were a standalone unit or accessory dwelling or anything. So, the information they sent us doesn't even really help us make the decision. Like it was, again, more form letter than anything.
Director Allen?
Thank you, if I may. We have close to 100 business licenses for all types of short-term rentals, recognizing, again, that's all types. When we collected that and sent out the email about the meetings that we were having and so forth, I think 7 email addresses bounced back as being wrong. It's possible we inserted them wrong. It's possible that they have a license but are no longer operating. But we also know the compliance level is low, and that's, I think, where a Granicus or a data company comes in handy. So when we talk about data or we talk about numbers of units, are we referring to those who have business licenses, or are we referring to everyone regardless of their compliance levels? So that would be one question I would pose. I mean, we proceeded along this path, this project, with the guiding principles in mind: neighborhood fit, housing supply, and so forth. And so I do feel compelled to remind council that that's where we came and how we arrived where we're at today. But I'll leave it at that.
Odette, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Chair Rowe. I have 3 more slides, and because of the nature of this topic, some of the questions touch on what I was about to say as well, and help to wrap the presentation component and maybe give a breadth of information that is helpful both in terms of the business licensing, the compliance, the monitoring, how do you take a leap and start a program, and how can we make decisions without data. I would appreciate an opportunity to complete the presentation. I think it might even be helpful, even though it adds more information. So there's pros and cons. But if the chair and council so wishes, I would offer that.
Sure, go ahead.
Thank you. And so just to complete the context here, the third topic that we were asking for council direction in this limited time was on the business licensing fee, and setting the right license fee is very important. Factors in setting that fee are: what's the anticipated cost of the program, what will be the regulatory requirements and enforcement, what are the number of STRs in the community, and the degree of compliance that's expected to be achieved. And so STRs that are, if they're occurring in primary residences or properties, the proposed average fee that we believe would pay for a program to pay for itself is here. We're proposing to revise it where it's rooms in your home is $500 a year, and in a self-contained suite on the property, $900 a year. So that is the ballpark of how that was also looked at from an issue of fairness. Was, does this reflect the about 3-day long weekend price, and that the operator is that's the price, the annual license fee of paying that. And there's of course a big range in what a 3-day long weekend looks like in Sechelt in those 2 categories, but that's what we felt would be appropriate rate that would cover the compliance monitoring, $16,000 a year, that would give the District of Sechelt data reports, plus an online licensing system to set it up, and one full-time employee to cover those added costs of communications, the application review, and enforcement. However, if it sounds like council and committee members are leaning toward wanting to have secondary homes through perhaps a temporary use permit, and that fee has an initial application fee of $1,800. So that's a one-time fee to process that application. There's no guarantees you're going to get the temporary use permit. And certainly it is subject to, as you were discussing, like not only the public notification process and some subjective matters, but some really matters that are quite substantial, like the fire department reviewing, oh, it's on a cul-de-sac street. We can't have overflow parking on this street, and having those management conditions built into the permit. So there's a temporary use permit fee of $1,800 for applying for that application process, plus an annual license fee of $3,000. So that's what's being suggested, because it would have greater staffing demands, monitoring and enforcement impacts. And so this is what's recommended, and I just note that that is the fee that is also what District of Squamish charges for the STRs that are accessory on a self-contained suite on your property. That is the fee that is charged in the process that is used, not for STR secondary homes. So just wanting to be clear, these are not comparing apples with apples, but that is the same fee, where it's the TUP fee plus the annual business license fee. So in the memo that was presented to council in advance of this meeting, there were recommended regulations for the STR regulations. So these revisions included things like, should there be, what are the unit types, some of the elements of compliance and enforcement, guest limits, health and safety inspections, parking andday limits. So there is a substantial breadth that went both into Andrew Allen's Director of Planning's report, plus the attached memo that I had written with recommendations. So it's not realistic to present all of those elements, but just to say that those were also elements seeking input, but are the three that we presented today are the top priority. And so seeking also business license fee guidance is the priority. And really, the final slide and the final word is that after establishing a program, and just taking that leap of faith, there will not be a perfect program from day one, but that there should be a commitment to monitoring and evaluation and conducting an annual review of the program and producing a report to council that includes a proposed program of improvements and assessment of the impact of the regulations that's essential for the program to be successful, and data that can be used to help evaluate the impact on the District of Sechelt in achieving its desired goals for neighborhood compatibility and housing, business regulatory equity, tourism, health and safety. So I have also in my memo summarized a table, which is what data would you be able to collect once you have a program established? And some of the things you can't even collect it. You don't even have access to the data until you commit to a program, until you commit to having a requirement for business licensing being on every online advertisement. There is no way to collect that data at this moment today. Only once you start the program do you start to be able to have the tools to collect that data. And so it's really important to have it's very realistic to have a proactive approach that uses third-party data monitoring program with dedicated staff paid for by the licensing fees, and a regulatory program that's simple to understand and well communicated. And having data is essential, absolutely. And diving in and just saying, is it good enough to try? And a commitment to monitoring and ongoing assessment and evaluation is a key part of that as well. And that concludes my slides. But I thought that it touched on many points that were being discussed, and I hope that that was not more information overload, but providing more support. So I'm happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Can we put the license fee slide back up? So, Odette, then if I have a room and a cabin, it's $1,400 a year. Do I read?
Correct.
Or am
There
I
is
only
two.
paying for one?
Yeah, so the concept is really, it is the cost of doing business is the cost of operating one of these licensed categories on a 3-day weekend, generally. And really the prices do range. So it was really a ballpark. Yes, it would be to be clear, it would be a $1,400 per year business license fee to have a room in your home, or up to a few rooms in your home, and up to 2 separate self-contained units on your property, because council has already directed in this meeting that there would be a limit of 2 self-contained dwelling units.
Okay, Mayor Segers has a question.
So my understanding was that if they have a self-contained suite on their property, they only get one business license. So if they have a room in their house and a suite, they would pay $900 for their license. They would get 2 licenses.
Yeah. I am proposing 2 licenses, and this is a council decision.
Okay. Okay, so we need to sort out if it's 1 license or 2 licenses. Okay, or 3 or 10, yes.
Councillor Scott.
When you mentioned Squamish charges that $1,800 setup, that slides over to the self-contained suite that would be $900 a year. There's an application fee to assess that. Is that what I understood you said?
So in the District of Squamish, they do not allow STRs of secondary homes. So let's slide our thinking over to that. So in the District of Squamish, it is a self-contained suite on your property, and it is a temporary use permit fee in the District of Squamish of $1,200 for the application fee, no guarantees, not refundable, plus $3,000 a year for the business license. That is the District of Squamish.
Okay, so they've made it really expensive. Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm stepping in for a moment. Are there any other questions or comments? Councillor Scott?
As far as it comes down to the principal residency requirement, I would be comfortable with if you have rooms in your home, it's $500. I would be comfortable if you have a self-contained suite on your property and rooms in your home, it's $900. I don't think we need to double license it. That's my thought. I mean, the reality is it's going to help with funding enforcement, but I'm really hoping in the principal residency side of it, there shouldn't be a whole lot of enforcement to take on, so we shouldn't penalize them that bad.
Okay, anybody else? Councillor Toth?
I agree. When it's principal residency, it should be largely self-regulating. I think, I think that the $500 a year for room in the home, there are going to be some people that may stop, because if they only rent out one room a few weekends a year, it's not going to make sense for them. But, if you've got one person who is on a regular and ongoing basis turnstiling that room every weekend and some of the weeks, then $500 is nothing. And those were my comments sort of in the beginning too, was that, if you're renting out a room in your home, I don't care. The $125 that we charge business licenses now is sufficient. So again, I don't know if this is something that needs a threshold as well. If it's a room, it's $250. If it's, 2 or more, it's $500. Just my thoughts, but I'd be okay with seeing that number come down a little bit.
So we have 2 options. One is looking at the rate that we charge, or the fee we charge for just rooms in a house. But I think there's what I'm hearing is that they either have rooms in the house or they have a self-contained suite and or rooms, and they have one license fee of $900 a year. Okay, so doesn't address, Chair's back here, so I want to talk about the commercial piece. I think what I'm hearing is we just need to take a leap and either pick a number or don't pick a number, but put something in place, because we won't actually have the data until we have something in place and can check that out. So I'd like to know what kind of number you're looking at.
Councillor Toth, you have your finger on the button.
I do, but I wasn't quite ready to go.
Sir, he's the one who said zero. Don't go to him.
It's true. I suggested zero was a perfectly valid number.
He's changed his mind before.
But, you know, there is that lack of data. And I know that there have been comments made to me privately and through email about the lack of data around the secondary residence portion. I'm in favor of taking a hardline stance on it. However, I seem to be in the minority in this, so I have to recognize the reality of the situation. But I think, you know, it doesn't really matter what number we pick. If everything's coming through as a temporary use permit, council is going to have a say on every single one of them that comes through. And the community, in theory, is going to have a say on every single one of them that comes through. Whether that plays out or how that plays out, you know, is a process yet to be determined. But if we bring in the suites and the rooms and houses, you know, I wonder if we could even have a year of transition where we're getting those units online, where we've got Granicus in place, where we can then look at how we implement the temporary use permits. Like, it's a lot of workload to try and take on for one date. And I think staggering it is going to be critical to ensure that we don't burn out our staff and our process. So I don't know if we need like a delay between when we take these things on. And Granicus with more detail might tell us that number right out of the gate. It might say that there's eight of them that are licensed right now, and so maybe 10 or 15 is the right number. Or it might say that there's 100, and we have to deal with that when it comes. But yeah, just my comments.
Director Allen, do you have a thought on having a delay between the residency versus non-residency?
I'm blinded by the hands beside you on both sides, so I'm not sure if it's my time.
Sorry. You have priority if you have a comment.
I'm not sure I have anything truly profound to offer.
Okay.
I think when it comes to Granicus and finding out what's out there, again, it's separating. Are we looking at everybody who's operating? Are we prioritizing those that are operating with business license now and you know, follow the regulations to date, even if they are dated? So that's one way of dividing that possibility. But in terms of the delay, I think we recognize this at the public meetings. You know, this isn't something that is going to overrule any bookings that are in place this summer, for better or for worse, depending on one's perspective. So frankly, we're challenged to find something that's going to be applicable before next spring, you know, when people start visiting and so forth, right?
Right.
So, I guess my thought is we've done a fair amount of work here in the last 4 months, and any premise of delay makes me a little bit nervous that work doesn't contribute to something.
Mayor Segers, or did Councillor Scott have a hand up?
Well, I think, you know, one of the pieces that's still hanging out there that we should probably address if we're going to delay the commercial side of it is, like we talked about, moving the residency with more than 2 secondary suites into a commercial zone or a commercial category. It almost creates 2 categories within the commercial. And I think we need to probably discuss that piece and put it to bed, because that's an easy one, I think, where the fees meet the meet the requirement. I guess my question, when it comes down to that, where Squamish has created this application fee for anything that's a standalone unit, it kind of makes sense because there is staff time involved that's probably going to require an inspection. And so when we look at anything where there is a standalone unit, whether there's residents on site or not, I would think it would make sense for us to have an inspection component to it. And what does that cost? Is it just part of the license, or is it become an application fee?
Councillor Toth.
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, well, you were going for it. Sorry. Such abuse, Mayor Segers.
Okay, so that brings up another question to staff. With this licensing, are we going to have to inspect all of them, including the rooms in the houses? If we're looking at enforcement around this, is that something that's going to be in? So it's not just necessarily for the commercial ones, but it's for all of them.
Yes, I believe we should. If a bike shop opens up on Cowrie Street, which it did, we inspected. If a professional services shop opens up, also very close by, we inspected. So what we'd be doing is be inspecting the suite, you know, if it were a suite in a dwelling. We're not peeling back the walls and requiring engineering to confirm that a house built in 1984 meets the 2020 building code, but we're looking at the suite and life safety. Do they have safe exits, appropriate exits? They have fire plan, almost like what you would see when you rent a hotel. So yes, we believe that it's been inconsistent in the past and needs to be brought up to speed a bit in that regard for the purpose of life safety.
Go ahead.
Okay, so if we were to now put a number in for the number of commercial ones we want, can we revise that down the road? We don't know how many we have. That's the problem. And if we have those who have more than 2 self-contained suites or self-contained units on their property, they're now also commercial. So do we have more than one commercial in the, you know, we've got 2 commercial categories basically. How many do we have? We don't know. Can we pick a number and change a number later if we so choose? I don't know. Director Allen.
Well, I would say today we're seeking direction on what number to prepare when we propose bylaws. And so we're not looking at making a decision or adopting anything today. So that would give a little bit more time to think about it. I do note that Sunshine Coast Tourism has offered to work with us to narrow that down a little bit, and hopefully we can include that as part of our next reporting back to you.
The letter we received from Airbnb to Director Allen, are any of the things that they offer? I haven't had a look at any of the portals or anything. Is there anything there that might help us drill down to exactly what's on their site as far as standalone, non-residential?
If I may, I'm looking to Odette perhaps to assist on this one. There was a meeting that I was unable to attend and she's met with them and might provide more clarity.
Yeah, thank you. And through the chair, we met both with Granicus to ask about the Airbnb offerings as well as with Airbnb directly, and researched the offerings of the various neighborhood and compliance programs. The data that they offer and provide is aggregate only. So it would not, it's not authentic in offering valuable data, and nor would it support compliance. It's aggregate. And there's also various portals that are for neighborhood complaints and best management practices, and portals for reporting that are limited to police staff only. And so the offerings are, it appears to be a really enticing and long list. And when you dig into what's being offered, it is not of great value, truthfully.
Thank you. Did someone have their hand up? Councillor Scott.
So On the application fee, I think anybody that already holds a business license within the district of Sechelt for a short-term rental would not need to go through an application process fee again. They've already been inspected, so we don't need to worry about that. It would be any new applications. On the principal residence side, with more than 2 suites, I think they would not take away from the number of commercial licenses that we have available for whatever number we land on. I don't think that those units need to be part of that number. It just falls into that different category of the fee structure. So, yeah, that's about what I have on that. Well, you know, the number, again, it's so hard to put a number. Yeah, and you know, maybe what we do is I mean, this still has to go through a number of different processes before it becomes a bylaw. So if we leave it at 30, and it kind of puts the onus on the short-term rental operators and Sunshine Coast Tourism to scramble as we work through public hearing and help us find that number. And then we can look at changing it later down the road, or we find that 30 works.
Can you make that into a recommendation?
All right. It's going to be a long one.
That sounds like what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So I guess we need to make 2 recommendations as far as the commercial one goes. So the first one is I would move that principal residence with more than two secondary suites moves into the commercial category and don't
Unlimited number.
As an unlimited number. And they just, so that's one.
There's a seconder for that, Councillor Toth. Any further comments or questions? Janice is still with us, okay. All right, I'll call the vote. All in favor? Janice, is your hand up? Yeah, there, she's in favor. So moved.
So I'm gonna also move that any short-term rental operator that has a current business license within the district of Sechelt won't be required to pay an application fee because they're already licensed and already been inspected.
There's a second. Councillor Toth for discussion. Mayor Segers.
Thank you. I'd ask staff, have they been inspected? Because I don't believe they all have been.
That's our understanding, and that many of these were issued a business license but not inspected, including very recently. So we have an inconsistent practice.
So we have an inconsistent practice. So we would have a record if they were inspected?
Yeah. If a house was constructed and it was issued a building permit, we assumed it was a house. It was inspected for a single family dwelling, whatever that may have been. But if there's a suite in it that we didn't realize was going to be a bed and breakfast, it's not inspected for that particular purpose. Similarly, if the whole house is rented, it may not have fire plans, appropriate egress, fire extinguishers, and so forth.
Councillor Toth.
Just to follow up on that, so I heard you mention, Director Allen, with the building permits, but with the business licensing, recognizing that they may or may not have been inspected as part of business licensing, if we did inspect them as part of business licensing, would we have a record of that inspection, or is it just a box that gets checked and then we move on?
Mm-hmm. If we did an inspection, utilized the inspection card as one should, we would have a record.
Okay, so we have a recommendation on the floor.
Could we have that recommendation read back to us, please?
I have that any short-term rental operator that has a current business license within the district of Sechelt won't be required to pay an application fee.
Okay, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think we want to We're looking to amend it, right? Yeah.
Oh, okay, I was just gonna, okay. Fine. Go ahead, Councillor Scott. Make it complicated for the chair.
Yeah, so I guess we can amend the motion and say that any current business license holder within the districts of Sechelt that we can find and provide proof of an inspection as it relates to the business license would not have to pay an application fee.
Seconder for the recommendation, Councillor Toth, or sorry, for the amendment. Just settle down. I'm waiting for Jen to catch up with the madness. Are you okay? All right, we have a second for the amendment, and all those in favor? And Janice's hand is up. Okay, so now we have an amended motion. Maybe, Jen, I could get you to read it back.
I'm going to have to play around with the words just a little bit here, but we got that any current short-term renter operator that has a current business license within the district of Sechelt find proof of inspection as it relates to the business license, and if that is then found to be available, not have to pay the application fee.
All those in favor? Janice's hand is up. Okay, so moved.
You gonna do this one?
Okay, so what about an application fee?
Well, that's a discussion. Director Allen, what do you think it costs? Like staff time, effort, processing, is it $1,000? Is it $1,800?
So $1,800 is the fee we presently have in place for a temporary use permit because of advertising and engagement and so forth. Again, rule of thumb and industry standard has been to look at sort of the long weekend fee that transfers. If the fee includes Granicus, possibly bylaw, staff increase, right? Then, and if we had,
I think we're spinning between the business license fee versus just the application fee, just to apply for the business license. So what does it cost us to process and do the inspection on the property and such?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Mayor Seegers.
And are we looking at an application fee for a room in a house and an application fee for the suites, or are we just looking for an application fee for commercial?
I think it should be an application fee for across the board. I don't think it needs to be the same number though.
so if you go from intake at the front counter and possibly phone calls, establishment, filing, inspection, reporting, review, you could be looking at 12 staff hours per license. So if you round that up, that's several $100s. If you look at, what is involved with staffing costs, the true costs, it's several $100s. I would suggest that our 125 and 150 two-tier business license scheme is pretty low.
Madam Chair?
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering whether our consultant would be able to provide any guidance on that when we bring it forward in terms of what other jurisdictions are doing in terms of fees. Because often when staff are setting any of our fees, we do look at what our other municipalities do. Just a thought, if that might help.
Thank you. Mayor Seegers?
Okay, so then at this point, let's say we would like staff to come back with a recommended application fee for each of the categories based on industry standards.
Is that a recommendation?
That's a recommendation.
They're seconded by Councillor Scott. Any further comments or questions on that? All in favor? Okay. Oh, she did, yeah. Okay, Mayor Seegers.
Okay, so I like Councillor Scott's comment about the industry and the residents in the community who are actually operating these facilities, bringing us data, verifiable data. So at this point, I would like to put forward that we limit the commercial, the separate commercial ones to 30 in the community and see where that gets us. And that could also be changed if we have data when this bylaw comes back to us.
It's been seconded?
Just point of clarification, that doesn't include the residence piece.
That's correct.
Right.
That was sorry, just to clarify.
This will be secondary dwellings as commercial short-term rentals.
Okay, and as part of the recommendation that staff try and work with tourism?
I think it's up to tourism and the community to work with us.
Okay.
We don't have the data. If they want us to change that number, they need to come forward with some data for us. And they'll probably have a few months to do that. Through this conversation, through the community work that we've been doing, I think they know who most of the people are. If they don't, the community organizations do. So I think that information's out there, that we can be informed through our community.
Sorry, Jen, can you read that recommendation back?
I have that the committee recommend that there be a limit of 30 commercial secondary dwelling units in the district.
And is there a second for that? Okay, I'm sorry. Sorry? Okay, go ahead. Councillor Taw.
Thank you, Chair. I won't be supporting this recommendation. Like I said, I do recognize that my position's in the minority, so, there it is. But I think if we want them to prove how many are out there now, we should be starting with a lower number and perhaps working up to it. We may find that there's only 20 secondary residents, specifically commercial operating, in which case everybody will be thrilled with 30. And they may not say anything. So I would be more in favor with starting with a lower number, 10 or 15.
Is that an amendment?
Sure, I'll make that amendment, that we amend it down to 15 units.
Seconded by Mayor Seegers. Any further comments? Oh, God.
Sure.
May I have a vote on the amendment to lower the number to 15? All those in favor? Now we're going to vote on the motion. Jan, I'm sorry, could you just read it back? This is just such a big topic.
Of course, through the chair, that the committee recommend that there be a limited of 15 commercial secondary dwelling units in the district of Sechelt. Short-term rentals.
All those in favor? Janice, did you put your hand up? I can only see your forehead. Janice, are you there? Or do you oppose?
No, I didn't.
Can we abstain her? Sorry, Janice, we can't hear you. Turn your video off and see if we can hear you. Motion's carried. Sorry, Janice. Are we okay, Ms. Frank? I'm worried.
Madam Chair, just procedurally, we will note in the minutes that we lost contact with Councillor Kuster because it was right at a crucial time when a vote was being taken, but there still was a majority vote, so we're okay.
Okay, we're moving on, Janice. We still can't really hear you clear enough. Okay, now, Mayor Segers.
Do we want to discuss the temporary use permit piece then? Because I think staff are looking for some direction on how we're proceeding with the commercial STRs.
Councillor Toth.
Just as a process thing before we go down that rabbit hole, given the time, are we still okay with our consultants, with our staff, et cetera? Or do we need to refer some of this to the next committee of the whole?
Director Allen, do you want to comment?
In terms of timing today and remaining time, I'm fine. Should we ask Ecoplan, Odette?
You're okay?
Carry on.
So let's just take a moment and review where we are. We gave a recommendation on short-term rental principal residency requirement, correct? Right? Short-term rentals for secondary residences, unhosted. We've just passed a recommendation on that. Business license fee, we haven't passed a recommendation on. So shall we go there? Okay. Could we put that slide up one more time? Oh, we're ready to go.
Yeah, I'll move that the business license fee be accepted as presented. So the 3,000 for the commercial, then 900 for the self-contained, and the 500 for in your home.
Is there a seconder? Seconded by Mayor Segers. Shall we wait? We better wait for Alton. Okay, so let's revisit that. Lights and format, and that would really cover off, once we settle this, the three major things you were looking for direction on? Right. Okay.
And just to be clear that we're not layering business licenses, as was suggested, no.
Councillor Toth. Yeah, we're waiting for you. No. There's a recommendation on the floor that the recommendation 3, as presented.
I don't feel strongly enough about it one way or another to move an amendment to it, so I'm happy with it as it is.
All right, any other comments on the recommendation on the floor? And I don't see Janice. All right, call a vote. All in favor? And that is moved. All right, so let's discuss temporary use permits. Mayor Segers.
So I'd like to recommend that the STR commercial in a non-residential, I don't know what you call it, secondary suite, secondary residence, be required to get a temporary use permit before being issued a license.
Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Toth has seconded. Any further discussion on this one? Councillor Scott.
I still have issue with it being notice on title and being able to be sold with the home. So I think that there's ways that we can create the same process as part of the business license without it adding that kind of value to the property. It would really be nice to have that business license die if the property sells. And I'm still struggling with it. I mean, there's so many pieces that we have to look at when we, as part of that application. And I guess it would, you know, even under the temporary use permit, we have to look at neighborhood fit. Do we want 3 or 4 of these things in a row? Well, no. And I don't think that changes whether it's a temporary use permit or we're just issuing a business license. I think if it came forward to the group as an application that there was 4 of these or all 30 or 15 that we accepted want to be in Tawanik, well, that's not going to work either. So we'll have to create some sort of policy around density of them as well. So Director Allen, I don't know how, like, you understand the gist of what I'm going here, but how do we get there?
Yeah, so the pros and cons here are business license is a little more streamlined and technical and administrative, and as long as we have a clear section in our business license bylaw, staff just follow it, issue the license. But somebody goes out of business on purpose or otherwise, and their license lapses and they sell the property, a new owner doesn't automatically have a license and has to come in and apply, meet the same criteria. The TUP allows for this more enhanced neighborhood discussion, perhaps referrals to community associations, neighbors, back to us to review, almost like a rezoning application in a sense, presentation to council, which yes, does add that political layer and political element and a significant more of staffing resources to put it all together, but it brings a little bit more of that community input into it than an administrative issuance will. But then being registered on title, carrying over to owner, brings in different implications. So it provides different opportunities, but there is no perfect silver bullet solution here. That's how I see it.
Councillor Toth. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The problem I see with doing it through something like business licensing is that at the end of your 6 years or whatever period, well, maybe John Smith lets it lapse because his time is up, but then his wife Jane picks it up and now they can go for another 6 years, or maybe their son picks it up and now they're 18 years they've been running it, right? The temporary use permits are stuck with that property. I guess the one question I've got from a process-wise is, can we stipulate in the temporary use permits that they cannot be transferred to a new property owner? Because if they can't, we've got it, we're done, right?
Director Allen?
I'm afraid I can't answer that specifically right now. I mean, it is regulated by Local Government Act. It does say it's issued for the land. I see Odette has her hand up. We'll see if she can clarify.
Go ahead.
Yes, thank you, through the chair. Just to say, it is a temporary use permit that has a 3-year lifespan, can be renewable once for another 3 years. Yes, it's registered on title. It still requires an annual business license and still requires meeting the conditions of that annual business license. So it does not, that license, business license, does not transfer to a new owner. So then it requires that application.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. So that's the way around it.
Yeah.
Do we have a recommendation on the floor?
Yeah, it was for the temporary use permit, so I'll withdraw my concern based on what we're told here.
Sorry, Jen, can you just read it back?
I have that short-term rental commercial in secondary residence be required to get a temporary use permit before being issued a business license.
All those in favor? Oh, and Janice's hand is up. So moved. Would you like us to talk about fines, Director Allen?
That would be wonderful. I was going to say the remaining items are there. And it would be more or less what we would bring back unless you read through it today and say that doesn't work for us and you'd like to pass an alternate motion. They're all up for discussion. We just wanted to make sure we got through the top 3.
What's council's wish to discuss it today? Looks like Mayor Segers is hot on it. So Mayor Segers.
I think there's a recommendation actually in here. Let me find it. On page 67, under 5, compliance and enforcement, fines of up to $500 per day for non-compliance are recommended. And I think staff would also come back with the graduated, right? So at what point do we pull a license? At what point do we revoke a temporary use permit? That could be part of that as well, I believe.
Sure. I will start off with a comment on bylaw enforcement generally. We receive complaints or find a violation. We investigate, we document and review and act fairly in every case, and that's our obligation. We seek voluntary compliance where possible, and then fines don't have to be 500 right off the bat, but there's an escalation that is possible under the BENS bylaw, and that's the one we made a larger amendment a year and a half ago or so, and that allows us to do that locally. Larger fines. I was thinking there was that one example, it was on the news a year or two ago, the woman in North Vancouver, and she had basically a hostel in her condo in the Stratia, and it was driving everybody crazy. She wouldn't stop. That's when you get to the next level and use the MTI and the long form and the charges under the Criminal Offence Act, and it's a lot more deeper. And admittedly, we hope to not have to go there, but that's basically how bylaw enforcement works in a very quick nutshell. So we can provide gradients. How we deal with revoking licenses and TUPs is a little bit more complicated, but we have conditions attached to permits.
Okay, so I would like to recommend that staff come back with fines of up to $500 per day for non-compliance.
Your seconder for that, and Councillor Toth has seconded. You want to speak? Yep, go ahead.
Just a quick question. Under the bylaw, the BENS bylaw, the limitation on fines is 1,000?
I believe it's 500.
Okay.
I was looking at, there's an act as well, legislation. So yes, it is 500. Otherwise, we're but 500 a day or 500 an offense can add up pretty quick as well, right?
Yeah.
So, but beyond that is when simply somebody will not stop regardless of enforcement. It's when you take different through the Offence Act and so forth.
For sure. Thank you.
Any further comments? All right. All in favor? So moved. Janice's hand is up. Sorry? Yeah, can I see your thing? Because I've lost mine. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, EcoPlan staff, for hanging in there, and our staff as well. Can I have a motion to adjourn, please? And second, all in favor?